Small world, the world of informative flashcards. Flashcards in the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Law, Carl, Republic Act, No. 6657 Part 2. What is the provision of the law regarding private commercial farming? Section 11 Commercial farms, which are private agricultural lands devoted to commercial livestock, poultry and swine raising, and aquaculture, including saltbeds, fish ponds and prawn ponds, fruit farms, orchards, vegetable and cut flower farms, and cacao, coffee and rubber plantations, shall be subject to immediate compulsory acquisition and distribution after 10 years from the effectivity of this Act. In the case of new farms, the 10-year period shall begin from the first year of commercial production and operation, as determined by the DAR. During the 10-year period, the government shall initiate the steps necessary to acquire these lands, upon payment of just compensation for the land and the improvements therein, preferably in favor of organized cooperatives or associations, which shall thereafter manage the said lands for the worker beneficiaries. Who has jurisdiction over agrarian disputes? Section 50. Quasi-judicial powers of the DAR. The DAR is hereby vested with primary jurisdiction to determine and adjudicate agrarian reform matters, and shall have exclusive original jurisdiction over all matters involving the implementation of agrarian reform except those falling under the exclusive jurisdiction of the Department of Agriculture, DA, and the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, or DNR. What is the source of funding for implementation under this law? The initial amount needed to implement this Act for the period of 10 years upon approval hereof shall be funded from the Agrarian Reform Fund. Additional amounts are hereby authorized to be appropriated as and when needed to augment the Agrarian Reform Fund in order to fully implement the provisions of this Act. What includes the sources of funding? Sources of funding or appropriations shall include the following: a. Proceeds of the sales of the Assets Privatization Trust. B. All receipts from assets recovered and from sales of ill-gotten wealth recovered through the Presidential Commission on Good Government. C. Proceeds of the disposition of the properties of the government in foreign countries. D. Portion of amounts accruing to the Philippines from all sources of official foreign aid grants and concessional financing from all countries, to be used for the specific purposes of financing production credits, infrastructures, and other support services required by this Act. E. Other government funds not otherwise appropriated. All funds appropriated to implement the provisions of this Act shall be considered continuing appropriations during the period of its implementation. What are the prohibited acts and omissions under this law? Section 73. Prohibited acts and omissions. The following are prohibited. A. The ownership or possession, for the purpose of circumventing the provisions of this Act, of agricultural lands in excess of the total retention limits or award ceilings by any person, natural or juridical, except those under collective ownership by farmer beneficiaries. B. The forcible entry or illegal detainer by persons who are not qualified beneficiaries under this Act to avail themselves of the rights and benefits of the Agrarian Reform Program. C. The of this Act to his land conversion by any landowner of his agricultural land into any non-agricultural use with intent to avoid the application oldlings, and to dispossess his tenant farmers of the land tilled by them. D. the willful prevention or obstruction by any person, association or entity of the implementation of the CARP. E. The sale, transfer, conveyance or change of the nature of lands outside of urban centers and city limits either in whole or in part after the effectivity of this Act. The date of the registration of the deed of conveyance in the Register of Deeds with respect to titled lands and the date of the issuance of the tax declaration to the transferee of the property with respect to unregistered lands, as the case may be, shall be conclusive for the purpose of this Act. F. The sale, transfer or conveyance by a beneficiary of the right to use or any other usufructuary right over the land he acquired by virtue of being a beneficiary, in order to circumvent the provisions of this Act. What are the penalties for the violations of this law? Section 74. Penalties. Any person who knowingly or willfully violates the provisions of this Act shall be punished by a. Imprisonment of not less than 1 month to not more than 3 years, or b. A fine of not less than 1,000 pesos and not more than 15,000 pesos, or both, at the discretion of the court. If the offender is a corporation or association, the officer responsible, therefore, shall be criminally liable. What bank is the financial intermediary for the CARP? Section 64. Financial intermediary for the CARP. The Land Bank of the Philippines shall be the financial intermediary for the CARP, and shall ensure that the social justice objectives of the CARP shall enjoy a preference among its priorities. What are the special areas of concern under this law? Special areas of concern. Section 40. Special areas of concern. As an integral part of the comprehensive agrarian reform program, the following principles in these special areas of concern shall be observed. 1. Subsistence fishing. Small fisherfolk, including seaweed farmers, shall be assured of greater access to the utilization of water resources. 2. Logging and mining concessions. Subject to the requirement of a balanced ecology and conservation of water resources, suitable areas, as determined by the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, or DNR, in logging, mining and pasture areas, shall be opened up for agrarian settlements whose beneficiaries shall be required to undertake reforestation and conservation production methods. Subject to existing laws, rules and regulations, settlers and members of tribal communities shall be allowed to enjoy and exploit the products of the forest other than timber within the logging concessions. 3. Sparsely occupied public agricultural lands. Sparsely occupied agricultural lands of the public domain shall be surveyed, proclaimed and developed as farm settlements for qualified landless people based on an organized program to ensure their orderly and early development. Regular farm worker refers to. Regular farm worker refers to a natural person who is employed on a permanent basis by an agricultural enterprise or farm. Seasonal farm worker refers to. Seasonal farm worker is a natural person who is employed on a recurrent, periodic or intermittent basis by an agricultural enterprise or farm, whether as a permanent or a non-permanent laborer, such as doorman, sacada, and the like. Farmer refers to. Farmer refers to a natural person whose primary livelihood is cultivation of land or the production of agricultural crops, either by himself or primarily with the assistance of his immediate farm household, whether the land is owned by him or by another person under a leasehold or share tenancy agreement or arrangement with the owner thereof. What is meant by agricultural free patents? Agricultural free patents are land grants awarded to natural-born Filipino citizens in actual occupation and cultivation for at least 30 years of alienable and disposable lands not more than 12 hectares, and have paid the corresponding real property taxes. Cooperatives refers to Cooperatives refer to organizations composed primarily of small agricultural producers, farmers, farmworkers, or other agrarian reform beneficiaries who voluntarily organize themselves for the purpose of pooling land, human, technological, financial or other economic resources, and operated on the principle of one member, one vote. A juridical person may be a member of a cooperative, with the same rights and duties as a natural person. What is meant by special patent? Special patent refers to patent issued only by the President of the Philippines, for a particular purpose. Reclaimed land along Roxas Boulevard and in Cebu, untitled patrimonial property in the vast area of Fort Bonifacio. What is meant by sales patent? Sales patent refers to the release for agricultural purpose the insular government property sales application under RA 3038. What is meant by miscellaneous sales patent? Miscellaneous sales patent refers to patents for residential, commercial, industrial, educational, charitable and other similar purposes. What is meant by private land? Private land refers to land devoted to or suitable to agriculture as defined in RA 6657 and owned by private natural or juridical persons. What is the retention limit in agrarian reform? Retention limit is the area that a landowner may retain after the taking. The retention limit is not more than 5 hectares of agricultural land, and the owner shall have the right to choose the area to be retained, which as far as practicable shall be compact and contiguous. Do children of landowner have retention limit also? Each child can retain 3 hectares, but need to be a. 15 years of age and above and b. tilling or directly managing the land. In what instance wherein the landowner or spouses can retain land unto 10 hectares? If the spouses chose the separation of property regime, in this case, each spouse can retain 5 hectares. Within what period the land awarded cannot be subject of a conversion? Within 5 years, as provided for by the Agrarian Reform Law, lands awarded to a tenant beneficiary cannot be subject of a conversion. What law that gives the municipalities the power to reclassify agricultural land? RA number 7150, or the Local Government Code, gives municipalities the power to reclassify up to 15% of agricultural land not covered by CARL to non-agricultural uses if it is deemed by the local council or Sanggunian to be either no longer sound for agriculture or substantially greater value if used for residential, commercial, or industrial purposes. As a rule, conversion of agricultural land cannot be allowed. What is the exception? As a rule, conversion of agricultural land cannot be allowed except agricultural lands when it destroys irrigation facilities and scarce availability of water. CARP stands for Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program. CARL stands for Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Law. DAR stands for Department of Agrarian Reform. PARCOM stands for Provincial Agrarian Reform Coordinating Committee. BARC stands for Barangay Agrarian Reform Committee. PARC stands for Presidential Agrarian Reform Council. DA stands for Department of Agriculture. DENR stands for Department of Environment and Natural Resources.